Hey everyone, Ethan here. In 2007, I discovered a series that I would become very invested in and spend way too much money on. And not just the games, but the cards and merchandise as well. Throughout Pokemon's lifespan, I have stuck by it for better or for worse just because I enjoy the gameplay and the Pokemon themselves that much. I've always considered it my second most played game series behind Halo. Pokemon is pretty much the sole reason I owned a DS and a 3DS. Much like Halo, Pokemon Red and Blue were not my first Pokemon games, but the remakes Fire Red and Leaf Green were the second games in the franchise that I ever played. Once I played my first Pokemon game, my interest in the series snowballed incredibly quickly. This video, or should I say series of videos, is going to be structured a bit differently. To start off, Pokemon has had a long-standing tradition of releasing two games at the same time as a pair, but they're almost identical with usually only a few very minor changes. For my videos, I will be talking about and ranking both games as one. Next is that Pokemon also likes to release an enhanced version of the pair of games that came before, seeking to add a small amount of new content and improve slightly on the pair it's succeeding. In this case, we have Pokemon Yellow. If things couldn't get any more convoluted, Red and Blue were remade into the aforementioned Fire Red and Leaf Green some years after the original games were released. To add a cherry on top, Pokemon Yellow was remade/reimagined as Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee much later with some differences, but while still being mostly just a modern remake. So with that information, I want to lay out how I plan on talking about these games. If you don't count the pairs as separate games, then there are 4 separate releases of what is almost the same game. I will make one video after another for each iteration, starting with Red and Blue, then Yellow, followed by Fire Red and Leaf Green, and finally Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Typically, the first video talking about the original games will go over everything in the game, while the following videos will mostly just go over the changes from the original. This is how I plan to tackle Pokemon games in the future that have a third version or remakes. Lastly, the footage you are seeing for this video is from Pokemon Red. With that long-winded explanation out of the way, there's a big question that needs to be answered before moving forward. What is Pokemon? Pokemon is a monster-collecting Japanese RPG where you go out into the world of Pokemon on a quest to become the best. The games revolve around catching and collecting Pokemon, battling with them, and sometimes fighting evil along the way. Pokemon Red and Blue specifically sees you as a 10-year-old boy setting out on your journey throughout the Kanto region to become the Pokemon champion. There are 3 main goals that are set for the player, with one of them being optional. Objective 1 is to become the Pokemon League champion by battling and collecting all 8 gym badges, which are held by gym leaders, powerful trainers set to test your mettle, then defeating the Elite Four. Objective 2 has you taking down a group of evildoers known as Team Rocket. This is a goal that wasn't planned but quickly becomes your responsibility. Objective 3, an optional objective, is completing the Pokédex, a device that catalogs each Pokemon and stores their information when caught. The game does have a story that I'd like to go over, but it is largely unimportant and clearly not the main focus of the game. However, if you don't want to hear about the few minor spoilers this game has in store, then you can skip ahead of this section. You are a 10-year-old boy, which in this world seems to be the age where you're supposed to set off, travel the world, and make something of yourself. You and your nameable rival are entrusted by your region's professor Samuel Oak to pick a starter Pokemon and complete his invention, the Pokédex, as it was his lifelong dream. At the same time, you start collecting gym badges to challenge the league, although collecting the badges doesn't have anything interesting plot-wise revolving around it. Eventually, you start seeing Team Rocket cropping up around the region, doing various dirty deeds, foiling them at every turn. Along your journey, your rival always seems to be one step ahead. He always has more Pokemon in his Pokédex and has more gym badges than you. Things get interesting when you discover that Team Rocket has a secret base located in the region's game corner. It is here where you first meet their boss, Giovanni. Team Rocket don't have an explicit goal, but instead seek money and power. You later even foil Giovanni's plans to steal the Master Ball, a Pokeball which will capture a Pokemon without fail. The final confrontation with him takes place at the game's 8th and final gym, where he's revealed to be the gym leader. Defeating him helps him rekindle his love for Pokemon battling, and he vows to disband the evil team and never return. The only challenge left is to become the champion by defeating the Elite Four one after another. However, the game pulls a fast one once the 4th and final Elite Four member, Lance, reveals that your rival has become the champion before you, setting up the final battle to determine the true champion of Kanto. Obviously, since you're the protagonist, you defeat him and become the champion. Oak comes to congratulate you and cement your champion status by entering you into the Pokemon Hall of Fame. With the plot out of the way, there's a simple question that needs to be answered. However, that answer is quite intricate and complicated. That question is, what are Pokemon? Pokemon are creatures that inhabit the world named after them. In Pokemon Red and Blue, there are 151 different species of Pokemon. Each Pokemon has a type, stats, moves, a level, and sometimes an evolution or two. I intend to go through each of their traits to flesh out what exactly they are and what their function is. 151 is a lot of Pokemon to start with, especially for an 8-bit Game Boy game. Well, while there are that many Pokemon, not all of them are unique and unrelated. Most of them actually evolve to and from others. A Pokemon is able to evolve up to 2 times. Once a Pokemon evolves, they cannot revert back to their younger selves. Whenever a Pokemon evolves, they turn into a new species. Take Squirtle for example. When it evolves, it becomes Wartortle. Wartortle is its own species while still being related to the Squirtle evolution line. Evolution in Pokemon Red and Blue can occur in 3 different ways and is specific to the species of Pokemon. The reason for a Pokemon to evolve is to get a stronger version of their previous form with better stats. Most of them evolve when they reach a certain level. The second most popular method is through giving them an evolution stone, and the final method is by trading them to another player. Which is pretty stupid, but I'll go more into that later. One of a Pokemon's biggest traits is its type or sometimes types. A Pokemon can have 1 or 2 types out of a pool of 15. The 15 types in this game are normal, grass, fire, water, electric, flying, fighting, psychic, poison, bug, ghost, ground, rock, ice, and dragon. A Pokemon's type is static and is the same across that same species of Pokemon. For example, all Pikachu are electric type. A Pokemon's typing determines what other Pokemon they're strong and weak against. Types defensively can be weak to, neutral against, or resist other types. The water type is weak to electric and grass while resisting fire, ice, and itself. Types offensively do not directly translate from their defensive properties. Even though water resists fire and ice, it is only strong against fire, but is also strong against rock and ground, which it doesn't resist. Same thing with its weaknesses. It may be weak to grass and electric, but out of those 2 types, only grass resists water. Water is also resisted by itself and dragon. Pokemon themselves can learn up to 4 moves to use in battle. They can learn new moves by leveling up or by using a move learning item on them. When a Pokemon is caught, they'll know the last 4 moves learned through level up. Moves, much like Pokemon, have a type associated with them. In these games, Pokemon are typically only able to learn moves that are the same type as them, although pretty much every Pokemon learns normal moves regardless of type. There are some exceptions and even patterns. Most water Pokemon are able to learn ice moves despite not being that type, and the reverse is also true. Moves come in a variety of different forms and serve a lot of different purposes. However, every move comes with a base power and base accuracy which determines how strong it is and how likely it is to land. They also have a certain number of power points which determines how many times they can be used. Moves are separated into attacks and statuses. Attacks are very straightforward, being a move that does direct damage to the target. The nuance comes from attacks being separated into physical attacks, which do damage based on the user's attack stat and the opponent's defense stat, and special attacks, which do damage based on the user's and opponent's special stat. In these games, physical and special moves are determined by what type the move is. Normal, fighting, flying, ghost, poison, rock, ground, and bug moves are all physical, while grass, fire, water, electric, ice, psychic, and dragon moves are all special. Funnily enough, in Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, the only dragon-type move was a move that did 40 HP of damage every time it was used, so it being special is actually irrelevant. Status moves encompass every single other move in the game, in which there's a lot of variety. Firstly are the moves that inflict a status ailment on other Pokemon, like paralysis, sleep, burn, confusion, etc. Then there are moves that either raise the user's stats or lower the opponent's, not to mention the moves that recover a certain amount of health. Lastly, there are the moves that usually do something unique, like eliminating all stat changes on the field, temporarily randomly disabling a move on the opponent, a move that changes your Pokemon's type to the opponent's, and the list goes on and on. An unfortunate downside to this game, though, is that to my knowledge there is no way to see what a move does apart from a very select few which are told to you by NPCs. This is a huge downside, as unless you already know what it is, you're just choosing based off of their name alone. I mentioned this somewhat briefly in the previous section, but each Pokemon comes with 5 stats: HP, Attack, Defense, Special, and Speed. HP is how much health your Pokemon has. Attack is how much physical damage your Pokemon does. Defense is how well your Pokemon can take physical damage. Special is both your Pokemon's ability to dish out and take special damage. And Speed is how fast your Pokemon is compared to the opponent and how likely you are to get a critical hit. There are also 2 stats which a Pokemon doesn't inherently have but can be altered in battle. Accuracy, which if raised or lowered will affect moves depending on that move's base accuracy. Evasion is your Pokemon's ability to dodge attacks and can be raised or lowered much like accuracy. Stats are raised when a Pokemon levels up, knocks out another Pokemon in battle, and by stat boosting items. Buffs and debuffs used in battle, whether they be from a move or item, aren't permanent and only last the duration of the battle. Each species of Pokemon have base stats for each stat, which give you a general idea of what each Pokemon excel in doing. Unfortunately, this can't be viewed in-game. However, a Pokemon's actual stats will usually reflect their base stats, so it's not needed that much. A Pokemon's level goes hand in hand with stats. The higher a Pokemon's level, the higher their stats will be. Although their stats do not increase exponentially, they will always increase by around the same amount every time that Pokemon levels up. Pokemon level up by gaining experience points, which are obtained by knocking Pokemon out. Some Pokemon need more EXP than others and are even sorted into 4 different groups which determine how much total EXP they need to reach the max level of 100. Pokemon cannot ever lose levels or experience points once they're earned. I've talked around it for so long, so I think it's finally time I dive into what Pokemon battles actually are. Battles are fought one-on-one with both sides having up to 6 Pokemon at their disposal. There are 2 types of battles in Red and Blue: Wild Battles and Trainer Battles. Wild Battles see you taking on a single wild Pokemon. You have the ability to run from the battle at any time, or you can attempt to catch the Pokemon. If your Pokemon is knocked out, you may send out another or attempt to run. You gain EXP when you knock out a Pokemon, but not when catching one. Your Pokemon can level up and learn new moves during battle, but not evolve. Trainer battles are more traditional, where there is no running. The only way to win is to knock out the other trainer's team of Pokemon. Your Pokemon will gain 1.5 times more experience points when knocking out a trainer's Pokemon compared to a wild one. The loser of any trainer battle will always pay a prize of Pokédollars to the winner. Battles progress by each side deciding what action to do each turn. This can be using a move, using an item, switching out your active Pokemon, or in the case of wild battles, running away. If an item is used or a Pokemon is chosen to be switched out, it will take priority over any move being used. A Pokemon's speed will almost always decide which Pokemon will move first unless Quick Attack is used, in which case Quick Attack will always go first. Any damage or status your Pokemon sustains in battle will persist outside of battle until they're healed. There is also a feature for trainer battles that lets you see which Pokemon will be coming out next after knocking the previous one out, and gives you the ability to switch your Pokemon out without wasting a turn. This setting can be turned off if you want though. A huge focus of the games and the series as a whole is catching and collecting Pokemon. So I feel it's important to highlight the who, where, what, and how of encountering Pokemon. Pokemon can be encountered all throughout the Kanto region, but there are specific spots where Pokemon can be found. This can range from tall grass to caves to bodies of water and even from other trainers. Multiple Pokemon can be found on the same route and subsequently the same patch of grass, but usually at different encounter rates. For example, let's look at Route 13's grass. 30% of the time you'll encounter Pidgey, 20% of the time you'll encounter Venonat, 40% of the time you'll encounter either Oddish or Bellsprout depending on which version you're playing, more on that later. 5% you'll find their respective evolution depending on your version, and finally the last 5% is Ditto. Every area that has grass, water, or whatever else is like this, which means that some Pokemon are rarer than others. Occasionally, you'll also encounter people who will want to give you a Pokemon or trade one of theirs for a specific Pokemon. There are also a select few Pokemon that you could find in the overworld that you can initiate a battle with, but only battle once. When it comes to catching Pokemon, the concept is pretty simple. You find a wild Pokemon by walking around in tall grass, a cave, or whatever else, and having one initiate a battle with you. Anytime during the battle, you can use your turn to throw a Pokeball which has a chance of capturing the Pokemon. A Pokemon's capture rate is determined by many factors, including what species they are, what level they are, how much HP they have, if they're status, and what type of Pokeball is being used on them. Typically, you want to weaken the Pokemon as much as you can, paralyze it or put it to sleep, and then start throwing balls. Some species of Pokemon are harder to catch than others, but there's unfortunately no way to see that in-game. You can carry 6 Pokemon in your party at a time, with the rest being automatically sent to your PC, which can be accessed in any Pokemon Center. As a fun little aside, you're able to nickname your Pokemon when they're caught so they're not stuck with their species name. There are a multitude of different items in the games which have a wide variety of uses. Items can be obtained by finding them around the region, having them given to you by an NPC, or by buying them from a store. All items are stored in your bag, which can fit up to 20 unique items. If your bag is full, you'll be unable to obtain the item. Thankfully, your PC can store any unwanted items. The most common items in the game are the ones that can be used in battle. This can range from potions and beverages that heal your Pokemon, Pokeballs that can be used to catch Pokemon, battle items which can temporarily raise your Pokemon stats, and a few other miscellaneous items that can cure your Pokemon of status ailments, revive them if they're fainted, and even restore their power points. Another set of fairly common items are technical machines, or TMs for short. TMs are single-use items that can teach a Pokemon a specific move. However, most TMs only have a single copy of them in the game unless it's purchasable, so it encourages you to use them diligently. There are also hidden machines, or HMs, that can be used an unlimited amount of times and are needed to progress through certain parts of the game. HM moves are usually decent to pretty bad, but aren't really a nuisance in these games due to most Pokemon already having shallow move pools. Much like HMs, there are also a handful of key items that are almost solely used to progress through the game. Although some, like the fishing rods and the fossils, can be used to encounter Pokemon or just are Pokemon waiting to be restored. The last set of items that are worth mentioning are the vitamins, which are the HP up, protein, iron, calcium, carbos, and the PP up. All of these will permanently raise a Pokemon's stat, or in the case of PP ups, will raise the max amount of power points for one move. Any item in the game that isn't crucial to progression or the Master Ball can be sold at any Pokemart for some sweet Pokédollars. I wanted to take a small step back and look at the designs of Pokemon as a whole and give my thoughts on them. The first generation of Pokemon introduced 151 different species of Pokemon. Their designs are usually based on an animal, food, or object and given its own spin or gimmick to make it unique. They're also usually colored and designed to reflect their type without having to look it up. Generation 1 is widely regarded as having the best lineup of Pokemon designs, which can be chalked up to nostalgia, although I will say that most of them, at least in my opinion, look anywhere from good to fantastic, with only a handful looking less than acceptable. But I've come to find that the beauty of Pokemon is that every Pokemon is liked or even loved by someone. Every person will probably have at least one Pokemon that they love, even if they don't care for the rest. It's probably a good time to give a short top 5 list of my favorites from this generation. I will say as 2 disclaimers that my favorites tend to shift a little from time to time, but are usually mostly the same. And also that I only ever consider final forms when considering my favorites because I consider a Pokemon's final form to be their complete form. Number 5 is probably Blastoise. Turtles are my favorite animal and the cannons in the shell are super cool. Number 4 is Poliwrath. Frogs are also an animal that I quite like, and the super simple design with the swirly chest always stuck out to me. Number 3 is Magneton. I tend to gravitate towards electricity as an element in games, and I've always liked the idea of magnetic abilities, so even if it's just 3 Magnemites stuck together, it'll always be one of my favorites. Number 2 is Venusaur. Bulbasaur was my first Kanto starter and is my favorite. Also, like I mentioned before, I like frogs, so what else is there to say? Finally, number 1 is Gengar. I don't know when I started liking Gengar or really even why I like him so much, but I think he looks both cool and a bit silly at the same time. Not to mention that it's super fun to use in game. Lastly, to give a few runners up, I would say I quite like Starmie, Rhydon, and Raichu. This generation may not have my favorite lineup of Pokemon, but it's certainly one of the best. Before I move on, I wanted to mention that my team for this game consisted of Blastoise, Arbok, Electrode, Arcanine, Exeggutor, and Aerodactyl. For these playthroughs, I want to try to use a variety of Pokemon, some of which I've never used before, while mixing my favorites in. A whole 10 sections later, and I'm finally back to talking about the game itself instead of concepts surrounding it. The game takes place and has you exploring the Kanto region, which is based on the region in Japan of the same name. Throughout the game, you'll encounter towns, cities, grassy routes, caves, mountains, bodies of water, and more. Typically, towns will act as a resting place but do not feature a gym. There are actually only 2 towns, being Pallet, which is where you live, and Lavender, which features a dungeon and Pokemon Tower instead. Cities are usually bigger and do feature a gym, Pokemon Center, and Pokemart. There is 1 city for each gym badge. Routes exist to separate 2 locations from each other. There are 25 of them. This is where you'll find a majority of wild Pokemon. Areas like forests, caves, mountains, and even some buildings act as dungeons, which are there to test the player's endurance, item use, and patience with their higher than normal wild encounter rate. There are also a fair amount of unique areas, like the Celadon Game Corner letting you gamble for coins to redeem for prizes, and Fuchsia's Safari Zone letting you catch Pokemon in a different way from normal. The game is actually fairly non-linear. While you do have to collect the first badge first and the 8th badge last, the 6 badges in between plus the other story events have more freedom in the order in which you tackle them. Once the 2nd gym is beaten, you're actually able to fight the 3rd through 6th gym in any order you want. Plus, if you really want to get weird, you could beat the 5th to gain access to the 7th gym, making for a super cursed gym order. Be careful though, as every trainer, including the gym leader's levels, do not scale to your team, so it's not wise to take on the 7th gym 3rd. The game blocks you from going to specific places throughout the adventure by placing some sort of roadblock that requires an item or use of an HM to get through. I want to take a second to talk about the composition of some of the gym leaders and Elite Four members' teams. Each leader and member have a type that they specialize in, which means that they'll typically only use that type of Pokemon. Although oddly enough, there are some weird exceptions like Sabrina, who uses Psychic Pokemon, having a Venomoth who is Bug and Poison type. In fact, every single member of the Elite Four has at least 1 Pokemon that doesn't match their type. Hell, Agatha is supposed to specialize in Ghost, but she's actually more like a poison specialist since her entire team is poison. Same thing with Lance and Dragon, with his entire team either being Dragon or Flying. These 2 cases are most likely due to there only being 1 evolution line for both Ghost and Dragon. Which begs the question, why would they have trainers specializing in those types rather than having the types that weren't represented like Bug, Flying, or the very powerful Normal type? There's also a bit of weirdness with some of the specific Pokemon of some of their teams. Like, why give Misty, the Water Gym Leader, a Staryu and Starmie instead of replacing one of them with the several other Water type options you have? This isn't just exclusive to her, as 4 other gym leaders do this. There is even one of them plus 3 of the Elite Four members that straight up have more than one of the same Pokemon. I don't know, man. I just feel like some of these teams could have been a little more creative. I haven't really discussed this before, but I wanted to briefly talk about this game's difficulty. The normal trainers in this game make up a bulk of your fights in this game. Typically, they'll have around 2 or 3 Pokemon and their AI will tell them to simply pick a random move. In my opinion, the game never really gets hard if you know what you're doing, and anytime I did struggle, it was usually because the AI used moves that increase my chances of missing or not moving at all. There are trainers in the game that use supposedly better AI, but it can be very easily manipulated. The intention of the better AI is to allow them to use moves that are super effective against your Pokemon. There is an unfortunate but funny side effect of this. The AI will even try to use super effective moves against your Pokemon even if they don't do any damage. Let's say you're fighting Lance of the Elite Four, who has this type of AI. He has 3 Pokemon with Psychic moves. If you were using Venusaur, a Pokemon that would normally not match up against them well, you would be untouchable. All 3 of his Pokemon with Psychic moves have moves that don't do damage, like Barrier, which raises the user's defense, and Agility, which raises their speed. As long as Venusaur or any other Pokemon that is weak to Psychic is out on the field, Lance will continue to spam the ineffective moves until the end of time. Also, to make it even worse for them, unlike the player, enemy trainers and Pokemon cannot run out of power points. This feature is also present in Yellow. I will admit that I like making the game slightly harder than they're supposed to be by disabling the ability to switch out after knocking out a Pokemon and not using items in battle unless I'm facing a Pokemon I intend to catch. Even so, I lost 3 total times in my playthrough, all of which were in my first hour of playing. 2 were due to me not being prepared enough for an optional rival fight, and 1 was me stubbornly refusing to use healing items before or during a trainer battle, thus making me lose. I'm not trying to knock the game for not being hard enough, I just wanted to give my experience to give a general idea on how the game plays. Much like the last section, I haven't really talked about this topic at length, but I feel it's necessary in this game. Pokemon Red and Blue are not perfect by any means and have a fair amount of flaws. I want to preface this by including a reminder that I wouldn't be making a video about these games if I didn't love them, but I do not want to ignore the issues that these games have. As I mentioned earlier, a potentially huge detractor from these games, especially for new players, would be the inability to see what a move does unless looking it up from an outside source or by going off of what the move does in a later game. But even that second option isn't super reliable, as some moves will be changed between generations. Next is probably one of my biggest pet peeves, which is the existence of 2 and sometimes even 3 versions of what is essentially the same game. Up to this point, you've been watching footage from Pokemon Red. But if you haven't played Pokemon before, you may be wondering, what is Pokemon Blue like? Well, you've pretty much been watching that too. It's pretty much identical in every way, the only difference being that some catchable Pokemon are exclusive to Red, while others are exclusive to Blue. That's it. Which is made even worse by the fact that one of the 3 main goals in the game is to complete the Pokédex, which cannot be done on a single cartridge. The reason the developers did this was to encourage the use of the Game Boy Link cable so that people would trade their Pokemon to each other. However, I think that this was handled poorly and should have instead just made Pokemon harder to get in each version instead of excluding them outright. This trend of 2 versions has continued to this very day, with the most recent releases being Scarlet and Violet. I will admit that over the years they have added varying levels of differences between the 2 versions, but never enough to justify their existence in my opinion. The next flaw actually piggybacks off of the previous one. Even if there was a single version, you still couldn't obtain every Pokemon in the game because there are 4 Pokemon that only evolve through trading them to another game, which means that there are some Pokemon you can't even use if you don't have access to another game. Rest in peace, my beloved Gengar. Additionally, it's especially hard to complete your Pokédex even when trading because you need to obtain one of each starter that you didn't pick. They also have to evolve in your game in order for their evolutions to be counted. There is no way to obtain a second starter, so the only way to complete a Pokédex would be to have 2 other copies of the game, with each starting with a different starter than you and trading them before they've evolved. Not to mention the similar mess with only being able to obtain 1 Eevee despite it having the choice of evolving into 3 different Pokemon. It's also worth noting that all types were not created equal in this game. It's made pretty clear after playing the game that Psychic and to a lesser extent Normal types are the two most powerful types in the game. First off, each type typically has a stat that the majority of those Pokemon excel in. Electric Pokemon are usually fast, Fighting Pokemon have high attack, etc. Psychic Pokemon have high special, which in this game acts as both your special attack and special defense. This combined with the fact that they're only weak to two types being Bug, which sucks in Red and Blue, and Ghost, which is actually bugged to not be able to hit Psychic types at all, leads to it being quite powerful. On the other side of the spectrum, Bug Pokemon are mostly useless because there exists only 3 damaging Bug moves, all of which have low to mid base power and aren't learned by that many Pokemon. Pokemon Red and Blue would probably be considered broken or at least maybe Bethesda quality if they were released today. Funnily enough, Pokemon Red and Blue released a year and a half earlier in Japan as Pokemon Red and Green, and were somehow even buggier than the versions we received in the US. I'm not going to go over every single bug in the game, but I will mention the ones that have affected me and will most likely affect you. The first and possibly most annoying is that if a move has an accuracy of 100%, it still has a 1 in 256 chance of missing, which occurred multiple times in my playthrough. The second, which doesn't matter too much, is that the move Focus Energy is supposed to increase your next move's chance to be a critical hit. However, it actually has the opposite effect and will decrease your chances. Next is the aforementioned Smart AI bug, which can trivialize fights that were otherwise supposed to be challenging. The last one I'll mention for now is one that can hilariously buff the player and cannot be avoided. Upon earning the 1st, 3rd, 5th, or 7th gym badge, your Pokemon will receive an invisible 12.5% boost to a specific stat depending on the badge earned every time they are sent out into battle. However, if any of your Pokemon stats are modified in any way, whether it be positive or negative, your Pokemon will receive another 12.5% boost. You can do this as many times as you want as long as the move or item that modifies the stat actually works. If you're interested in learning more about the glitches in Red and Blue, I will link a page that documents all currently known glitches in the game. In terms of graphics, you can pretty easily tell that these games are not new. They look passable for 8-bit games, although some of the Pokemon sprites go from okay to questionable to downright horrifying. The games are originally in black and white, but will change to the color of the version you're playing if you're playing on a Game Boy Color. The music and sounds in this game are quite good. Unfortunately though, the music is often cut off by sound effects due to the Game Boy not being able to play more than a few sounds at a time. The soundtrack itself though is great and has really aged well. My favorite track is the Champion's theme. Pokemon Red and Blue were released in North America in 1998 on the original Game Boy. Like I mentioned before, Pokemon games typically have a weird past and have enhanced versions and even remakes instead of re-releases. Pokemon Red and Blue themselves are technically made from the Japanese Pokemon Blue, which itself is an enhanced version of the original Red and Green. Red and Blue can be played on Game Boy consoles up to the Game Boy Advance SP. Red and Blue would also see an enhanced version in Yellow, then Red and Blue were remade with Fire Red and Leaf Green, then Yellow was remade with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Red and Blue did actually see a re-release on the 3DS in 2016 as an eShop exclusive game for a low $10, and even let you transfer your Pokemon from those games to newer games. Unfortunately, the games are no longer available since the eShop's online services shut down in March of 2023. That means the only legal way to buy the games nowadays is to buy a used copy online, which can go for as little as $10, but more commonly for around $50 to $80 USD. Hopefully with the recent shutdown of 3DS services, Nintendo will finally decide to put them on Switch Online's Game Boy player. Besides playing them on original hardware, you could always turn to the dreaded E-word that Nintendo hates so much. Before I go into ranking these games, I want to clarify something that I may not have mentioned clearly enough in my previous videos. The ranking list will not stop at 10. I plan on making these videos as long as I have games that I like enough to talk about. This series serves several purposes, but for me personally, it allows me to play through games I would consider my favorite, evaluate them, and determine just how much I like them compared to all my other favorites. Pokemon Red and Blue will be placed on the same spot as I consider them to be effectively the same game. I, however, will rank their enhanced versions and remakes separately. With that said, I feel that Pokemon Red and Blue belong in the number 6 spot on the list below Mario Superstar Baseball. Games in this series are a weird case due to being able to compare them to so many other iterations of itself, so it should come as no surprise that Red and Blue are currently at the bottom, since it's clear that Pokemon can and will do better. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played Pokemon before? If so, what did your team look like? Also, my next video will most likely be about Pokemon Yellow. Here's the team I plan on using for that playthrough. If you'd like to suggest nicknames for any of these members, please feel free to comment your suggestions below. I appreciate and look forward to all feedback, comments, and hopefully likes. Thanks again, and I hope to see you again soon.